Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 49, The History of Cuba. So typically when doing my drink for the episode, I try to find something from the country itself, but due to the embargo between my country, America, and Cuba, Cuban products cannot be imported into the US. So instead, I tried to make Cuban coffee. Cuban coffee is supposed to be made using a mocha pot. The first drops of coffee are supposed to be mixed with sugar to create a foam, and then that is stirred in with the rest of the coffee, and it's supposed to be super flavorful and strong. I bought a secondhand mocha cup, and the first time I tried to make it, the handle melted off. I tried at several other points to make Cuban coffee, but I just could never make that foam. Skill issue, I guess. I was able to get some Cuban coffee from this really cool Caribbean sandwich place in Seattle called Paseo, and the coffee they made there was pretty good. Really dark and strong. Overall, if you want to get it or you are better at making coffee than me, I'd recommend getting some. But enough of me being terrible at making coffee, let's talk about Cuba. The Republic of Cuba is located in the Caribbean, being the furthest northwest of the Greater Antilles island chain. It has the American state of Florida north of it, the Bahamas northeast of it, Haiti east of it, Jamaica and the British-controlled Cayman Islands south of it, and then the Gulf of Mexico west of it. Cuba is a tropical country, with it being hot year-round, and vegetation found abundantly throughout the island. There are 3 mountain chains, found in the far west, the south-central, and the southeastern sections of the island. These mountains tend to be slightly colder and more foresty. Cuba has a little over 11 million people living in the country. The ethnic/racial makeup of the island is a little unclear. Some sources will say Cuba is majority white, while others will say it's majority black. But ultimately, Cuba is like many Latin American countries, a place where most people are mixed to a certain extent, with European, Spanish, Galician, French, Italian, and white American ancestry, mixed with various African people groups from West and Central Africa and the indigenous people of the island. Other racial/ethnic groups include Chinese, Jewish, Haitian, and Arab Cubans. Language-wise, most people's first language is Spanish, the official language of the country. Besides Spanish, the Haitian community will often speak Haitian Creole, and English is seemingly somewhat common among those in the tourism sector. Religion-wise, Cuba has a slight Catholic majority. That being said, Catholicism in Cuba is complicated by the fact that many Cubans will practice syncretic religious beliefs, mixing Catholicism with traditional African religious practices. The largest of these syncretic groups would be the Santeria, with something like 8 to 15% being practitioners of Santeria. Other religious groups include various Protestant churches, Seventh-day Adventist, Jews, Muslims, and various other folk religious beliefs. Cuba also has a fairly large non-religious population, making up 25 to 45% of the country. Before I begin talking about Cuba, I just want to spend a second and talk about the main source I used for this episode, An American History of Cuba by Ada Ferrer. The book is a look at Cuban history going from the start of European colonization to the first couple years of Miguel Diaz-Canel's rule. As the name suggests, it's a book that is designed for an American audience, so it often highlights interactions between America and Cuba, which, as you'll soon see, is a major driving force in Cuban history. I did admittedly get frustrated at parts of the book, as some decades I felt like the last decades of Spanish rule, the 70s and 80s were kind of somewhat brushed over, and only certain aspects of those periods were really looked at, while Cuba as a whole seems to almost take a backseat, and I feel like it can hold your hand a bit at certain points and is almost yelling, "Hey American, Cuba connects to your country." But I would say overall, besides that, I thought it was a pretty good book, and if you're curious on Cuban history, I'd encourage you to give it a read. So with that out of the way, let's get to the history. Humans have been on Cuba for thousands of years. There were 2 main indigenous people groups. First, in the far west, were the Guanahatabes. They were a hunter-gatherer people who may have been in Cuba before 1000 CE. The second large group were the Taínos. They were found throughout the rest of the island and were largely agriculturalists, divided into various tribes led by caciques. They planted cassava, pigeon peas, cacao, bananas, and tobacco, used mounded fields to improve drainage, and spoke a language related to Arawakian languages found in northern South America. The Taino people were found throughout the northern Caribbean, and those in Cuba frequently traded and intermingled with their familiar cousins in Hispaniola. The indigenous people's way of life would completely change with the arrival of the Spanish. Columbus had, in his first voyage to America, landed on Cuba in late 1492. The Spanish would claim the island, but not settle it at first. instead choosing to colonize Hispaniola. The colonization of Hispaniola can only be described as genocide, as disease, massacres by the Spanish, and mass enslavement had resulted in almost the entire Taino population of the island disappearing. Some of those Hispaniola Tainos would flee to Cuba, but along with them came the Spanish. In 1511, the Spanish set up the first Spanish colony in Baracoa, in the far east of the island. While the Spanish royal authorities did seek to prevent the outright slaughter that happened in Hispaniola, disease still wiped out large chunks of the native population, and forced the population into encomiendas, where natives were put under serf-like conditions and forced to mine gold for their Spanish overlords. According to Ferrer, mass suicides took place to avoid the abuses of the Spanish. Cuban resistance to colonial rule started very early. Within the first months of Spanish rule, several Taino revolts would break out. The most notable of these would be that of Hatue, a cacique that fled Hispaniola and would wage a guerrilla war for several months against the Spanish before being captured and burned at the stake. Hatue would famously remark when being asked to convert, if heaven is where the Spanish go when they die, and then demanding to be sent to hell so he wouldn't have to be with the Spanish. Several native revolts would follow Hatue's rebellion, going into the 1510s, but by that time, Spain had firmly taken over the island and stripped it of any gold that may have been found. In 1511, the island had around 100,000 natives. Less than 50 years later, the native population had dropped down to 5,000 by 1550. The native population continued to decline as the years went on. Today, there's still a decent number of Cubans who claim indigenous ancestry, and even some Cubans living in rural parts of the country who continue to identify as Taino and indigenous. The Spaniards who settled Cuba in those first decades also didn't last. Some were killed by rebelling Taino or died by other means. Many would ultimately leave the island in the 1530s and 40s when it became clear Cuba wasn't that rich in gold, and better opportunities were found in Mexico or South America. Still, Spanish colonization persisted. More settlements were set up. Particularly notable would be the city of Havana in 1514. Havana was located in northern Cuba, right on the Gulf Stream, making it a natural staging area for the Spanish ships going to and from the New and Old World. This saw Havana grow as the economy became centered around accommodating Spanish treasure fleets that stopped by every year. By 1607, it was made the capital of Cuba, and by 1700, it was the third largest Spanish city in the Americas. Other parts of Cuba also expanded, as the eastern mountains were found to be rich in copper, and communal land use was common in much of the rural countryside. While in the first centuries of Spanish rule it wouldn't be as relevant to Cuba's economy, sugar slowly started to become more and more important. Sugar plantations at first were worked by the indigenous peoples of the island, but as the native population began to decline, more and more African slaves were starting to be brought over. Slowly, Cuba's black population rose more and more, until eventually by the 1700s, the island was majority black. Slaves in Cuba before the 1800s were given more legal protections than those in British America, being allowed to buy their own freedom, and even denounce cruel masters. Slaves living in urban areas in particular were given relatively nice accommodations, able to easily work side jobs, attained freedom and some level of wealth, and didn't have to suffer the brutal working conditions out in the sugar or tobacco fields. Slowly, a free black population began to grow in Cuba. This all being said, obviously, slavery was not desired at all by the enslaved Africans taking from their homes, and while they technically had some legal protections, slave masters who often were friendly or just were colonial authorities often were able to largely do what they pleased with their enslaved. Pretty early into Cuba's history, Cuba became a target for Spain's rivals. The very first raid against the Spanish would occur in 1538 with a pirate raid on Havana. The city would end up getting sacked in 1555 by French privateers. This prompted the Spanish to fortify Havana and the island, which would be useful for future raids and assaults. This, however, would fail to stop a British invasion in 1762 during the 7 Years' War. The British were able to, after a tough fight against Cuban militiamen, take Havana and would end up occupying the island for a year until hostilities between the British and Spanish ended. This year would prove very important for the development of Cuba, as the British helped the expansion of the sugar industry, which increased the demand for slaves on the island, and developed trading links between British America and Cuba. These links would prove helpful for the Americans, as the Cuban colonial authorities helped finance the American revolutionaries during the American Revolution. While interaction between what would become the United States and Cuba could have been present for thousands of years, the late 1700s would start to see Anglo-Americans and Hispanic Cubans develop ties which would be a major driving factor in Cuban history up till today. I mentioned the demand for slaves increasing after the British occupation, and this exploded after the Haitian Revolution, as many slave owners fled Hispaniola and settled in Cuba. The Spanish government sought to incentivize large sugarcane plantations, importing more slaves onto the island and reducing taxes on sugar producers. This resulted in Cuba becoming one of the biggest sugar producers in the world, making the colony and many of the largest landowners fabulously wealthy. This wealth would not trickle down to the benefit of the hundreds of thousands of slaves who were being trafficked, often illegally, to the island. On the contrary, life for the enslaved became even worse, as many of the rights slaves had, which may have been artificial but still offered some protection, were now just completely overturned or just blatantly disregarded. And as working conditions became tougher and deadlier, corporal punishment became more common. These tougher conditions would ultimately lead to an increase in slave rebellions against Cuban authorities and rich planters. The 1840s would see some of the largest revolts break out on the island. This would force, in the 1850s, colonial authorities to slowly start to phase out slavery by declaring all slaves who came to the islands illegally freed, a majority of the island's enslaved population. While slavery slowly started being phased out, American slavers increasingly set up shop in Cuba. This increased dramatically after the American Civil War, as many Confederates moved to the island to continue living the antebellum fantasy in Cuba. Interestingly enough, the increase of Americans actually decreased a growing movement on the island for America to buy Cuba. As early as 1809, Americans had started considering buying Cuba. This was at first mostly seen as a form of manifest destiny to expand America. But during the antebellum period, many of those who argued America should buy Cuba wanted Cuba to help expand slavery in the country and increase the political capital slave states held. And many rich Cuban elites actually openly started backing this. In 1851, American filibusters led by Narciso Lopez hoped to free Cuba from Spanish rule and likely put it under American rule. Also ironically, Lopez was actually a Venezuelan royalist 30 years earlier. Lopez's expedition, despite widespread support across the United States, was quickly defeated. After the Civil War, many slave owners in Cuba changed their minds on American annexation, fearing that the newly victorious Union would outlaw slavery if Cuba was taken. But as American annexation fell out of favor with Cuban elites, another political ideology was rising: Cuban nationalism. Calls for Cuba to become its own country, free from Spain, had existed starting in the early 1800s. These early Cuban nationalists were severely suppressed by the Spanish authorities and elites, fearing a Haitian-style revolution from breaking out in Cuba, and also not wanting Spain to lose all of its holdings in the Americas. By the 1830s, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a scattering of islands still were under Spain's control, which resulted in an influx of royalists from other parts of Latin America who helped shore up and quell any nationalist agitation. But as the decades wore on, nationalist agitation began rising to the forefront. The Lopez expedition, while almost nakedly an American affair, did have some support from Cubans hoping for independence. Plenty of small-scale conspiracies and revolts would take place until 1868, when plantation owner Carlos Manuel de Cespedes freed his slaves and asked them to go to war with him to free Cuba from the Spanish yoke. Cespedes would be joined by thousands of more men and ended up taking large chunks of eastern Cuba, starting the 10 Years' War, the first major war for Cuban independence. The rebels would burn plantations, set up a rebel government, and called for racial equality for all Cubans. Despite this, the rebel forces would suffer with racial infighting in their ranks, as white officers disapproved of black officers taking control of important theaters of the war. Cespedes would be killed in 1874, and by this time, the war was more of an insurrection than anything else. Finally, in 1878, the war would end. This was followed very quickly by the Little War, which was fought primarily by black insurgents who wanted an end to slavery. This Little War would end shortly afterwards in 1880. Before we go to the final war for Cuban independence, let's take a second and look at some changes going on in Cuba during this time. Firstly, as a result of the 10 Years' War and the Little War, along with a growing abolitionist movement, Cuba would outlaw slavery in 1880, freeing all black people on the island, although an economic and social divide still remained between white and black Cubans. At the same time, more people were beginning to enter Cuba. Most notable would be a large number of Chinese laborers, who were brought over as a source of cheap labor as slavery entered into a decline, and these Chinese laborers would form the nucleus of Cuba's Asian community. Other immigrants would include those leaving Spain primarily from Galicia and the Canary Islands, regions that were economically struggling during this time. Americans also continued to move into Cuba, many of them businessmen. At the same time people were entering Cuba, some Cubans started leaving, mostly going to America, wanting to escape the turbulence of the island, and many being political exiles, who continued to plot for Cuban independence. Spain did try to halt the growth of nationalist movements by promoting reforms like the abolition of slavery and some democracy and representation for the island in the Spanish Cortes, or Spanish legislature, but these reforms were too little too late, and Cuba would again in the 1890s go to war. The Cuban War for Independence would begin in 1895, with a group of Cuban exiles landing, albeit with a lot of difficulty, on the shores of Cuba. This, as you will see, becomes a recurring theme in Cuban history going back to the Lopez expedition. These Cuban exiles were members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and were led by José Martí. Martí, like the Cuban revolutionaries in the 10 Years' War, demanded racial equality and promised a Cuba free from both Spanish and American domination. Martí would die quickly after landing, but he would inspire many Cubans to go into revolt, and once again eastern Cuba would become a hotbed for insurgent groups. Spain would, in response, try to crush the Cuban revolutionaries through brute force. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans would be forced into re-concentration camps, designed to prevent the rural population from aiding the rebels. Foodstuffs throughout the island were burned, and famine and disease broke out. It's estimated close to 175,000 Cubans were killed in re-concentration camps. Despite this, Cuban revolutionaries refused to give up, and by 1898, they had taken large sections of the island, with the support of a wide segment of the population, ranging from ex-slaves, peasants, doctors, urban professionals, and even ex-plantation owners. Spain had gotten so desperate and the war had become such a burden that they promised further autonomy to the Cubans. But this was widely rejected by both Cuban nationalists as not being enough, and royalists who felt this was a sign of weakness. However, these royalists would see how weak Spain was when in February of 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana's harbor. Today, the explosion is generally considered to have been a ship malfunction, but at the time, most of the American public and press believed Spain was responsible. Most Americans, for various reasons, already sympathized with the Cuban revolutionaries. Many were like the American expansionists of yore, wanting America to annex the island, or at least for Cuba to fall under American orbit. Others viewed the Cuban plight as similar to the American Revolution over 100 years ago, while many African Americans were sympathetic to the anti-racist goals of the revolutionaries, and others simply wanted a chance to prove their manhood in an exotic conflict. The Maine sinking and the US public wanting war led America to declare war on Spain in April, and the Rough Riders, a motley crew of various American volunteers, would lead the charge in taking the fight to Cuba. After several months of fighting with some of the most famous battles outside Santiago de Cuba, in both a lopsided naval engagement and the heroic taking of San Juan Hill, Spain would be forced to surrender Cuba and signed a peace treaty with the United States, giving Cuba over to the US. This treaty would not have any Cuban representatives present, an ominous sign for the next half-century of Cuban-American relations. Starting in late 1898, the American military occupied the island. This occupation wasn't to plant the seeds of a new American colonial government, but rather an independent Cuba. That being said, the military government did want to set Cuba up as a friendly state to American interest. One of the clearest examples of this was its policy rebuilding the island. The war for independence had brought widespread destruction and many businesses were beyond repair. The military government, in response, helped American businesses repair, but poor Cuban farmers were left with little to no aid, which resulted in American businesses coming to dominate the island, and in particular its sugar production. Another thing that hurt poor Cubans was most of the rural communal land was broken up, and rich landowners were allowed to pursue legal claims to force poorer farmers who had historically shared the land with them to be forced off, resulting in a transfer of land from the poor to the rich. Other policies included expanding public education on the island, a reduction in tariffs on American products, and Cuba leasing a large part of Guantanamo Bay to the American military to serve as a naval base. In 1900, a constitutional convention would be held, with around 24 Cuban delegates declaring Cuba a presidential republic in the same vein as the United States. But before independence would be granted in 1902, the Platt Amendment would be signed by U.S. President William McKinley, which essentially said Cuba was going to be an American protectorate, with America dominating Cuba's foreign policy and America allowed to interfere in Cuban affairs. It is in this environment that Cuba is finally handed over to the Cubans to rule. Cuban politics in its early days of independence was dominated by conservatives, who under Thomas Estrada Palma managed to win the presidency, and liberals, who were supported by many Afro-Cubans. Tension also existed between those veterans from the wars of independence who had fought for years against the Spanish, versus those who joined in the final months when victory was certain. In the 1905 election, Palma won a second term, but he was accused of rigging the vote, and many liberal veterans of the Wars of Independence went into revolt. This resulted in America intervening and occupying the country for another 3 years, only returning power to the Cubans in 1909. Politics after the American occupation continued to be dominated by liberals and conservatives under newly organized parties, but were largely elite-driven organizations. Let's take a second and look at some important economic and social developments. Some of these I touched up on with the new policies of the American occupation, which saw a wealth transfer from poor Cubans to the rich and American businessmen. There was a segregation between the rich and poor socially, and even racially, as many private institutions were designed as all white with black members barred. Continued American investment also saw new economic ventures take up a bigger part of the economy. Coffee, which had been increasingly important over the years, steadily continued to climb. More significantly would be tourism. Many Americans chose to travel to Cuba, with it serving as an exotic tropical getaway. Prohibition helped further boost the tourism industry, with many Americans who wanted to drink traveling to Cuba. Fun fact, a lot of popular rum cocktails have their origins in Cuba. Gambling also brought many American tourists to Cuba. Interaction with America saw American music, culture, products, and fashion become more and more popular in Cuba, and in particular in Havana and other provincial capitals. However, in the rural countryside, these changes were muted, especially as these were the areas that were hardest hit with the new economic policies of American-aligned Cuba. New highways and railroads were also built during this time. Cuban politics for the first decades of the 20th century became increasingly toxic. Elite-driven politics continued to remain the norm, and corruption became more and more common as the years went by. Racial tension also increased. Perhaps the bloodiest explosion of racial tension would occur in 1912, when the small Independent Party of Color, a party representing Afro-Cubans that called for racial justice, called for armed demonstrations against the government. This resulted in a massive government crackdown against the party and sent in the army to crush any anti-government feeling in eastern Cuba, with over 2,000 to 6,000 killed, many not even being associated with the protesters. After conservatives dominated the 1910s, liberals managed to rule for much of the 1920s. And in 1924, Gerardo Machado was elected president. Machado, initially a reformer, quickly transformed into a power-hungry dictator, cracking down on any dissent against him. As the Great Depression rolled around, unemployment grew, public sector jobs went without pay for months, and poverty increased, with protests, often headed by University of Havana students, becoming increasingly common. The newly formed Cuban Communist Party and various labor unions also protested Machado, striking against him in 1933, which resulted in mass protest, and the American ambassador demanding Machado leave, resulting in his overthrow. Also, fun fact, if you want to see a fictionalized but very accurate depiction of the overthrow of Machado, you can watch the 1985 film Vampires in Havana, which is the tale of how European vampires fought American gangster vampires trying to acquire Vampisan from an opposition fighter who was sleeping with Machado's wife. A very realistic depiction of the overthrow of Machado, and can be found for free on YouTube. Machado will be replaced by Carlos Manuel de Cacepedes, the son of the famous 10-Year War revolutionary. Cacepedes was a fellow liberal like Machado, and while he did incorporate some opposition elements into its ranks, he wasn't popular, was viewed as a puppet of the American ambassador, and the economy continued to suffer. A little less than a month after taking power, Cacepedes would be overthrown in the Sergeants' Revolt. At first, the revolt was just junior officers complaining about pay, but quickly evolved to junior officers taking over military bases across the country, with university students rushing to their defense. After only a day into the revolt, Cacepedes stepped down, letting the rebels take control of the government. The rebelling officers quickly found a spokesperson in Fulgencio Batista, who would quickly rise to become a commander of the armed forces. This, spoiler alert, would lead to him becoming immensely powerful. Political power will be transferred to university professor Ramon Grau. Grau's government, known as the 100-Day Government, quickly got to work reforming the country in an authentic revolution. He championed progressive reform, giving women the right to vote, established a minimum wage, promoted greater peasants' rights, worked closely with labor unions and students, and nationalized several sugar mills. While Grau wasn't outright hostile towards the U.S., he did argue the Platt Amendment should be abolished, and wasn't as subservient to the Americans as previous Cuban governments were. This, along with his more left-wing policies and a growing trend of sugar workers occupying their job sites, led the Americans to seek his removal. The Americans would find an ally in that new commander of the army, Batista, who in early 1934 removed Grau from power, forcing him into exile. Grau's reign would be quick, but it would certainly be impactful. While Batista wouldn't assume political control right away, he did from 1934 to 1940 control various Cuban presidents and was seen as the real power behind the office. Batista is fascinating because he on one hand was backed by America and traditional political elites, seen as a counterweight against Grau's reformers who would form around the new Auténtico party. But also, on the other hand, his role in removing Casas earned him the respect of those who wanted change in Cuba. He also was sympathetic towards more populist measures and favored a more proactive government in the economy and labor relations. This ultimately led Batista to be supported by a bizarre Frankenstein coalition of both conservatives and the communists. Batista would push forward the 3-year plan in 1937, which was designed to bring about some reform in the healthcare system and some land reform. 1940 would see a constitutional convention take place, resulting in the 1940 Cuban Constitution, which was noted for being very progressive for its time and expanded social rights. After the Constitution was ratified, presidential elections would be held, which saw Batista win. The 1944 and 1948 election would see Grau and his allies in the Auténtico party win, but Batista's influence remained strong. The years following the 100 Days government would see Batista at the height of his prestige and power, and would be referred to as Pax Baptisa. But while Batista was popular, democracy was expanding, and there was hope for the future, as the 40s went by, increasingly discontent began to boil to the surface. Corruption had firmly entrenched itself in Cuba in the Pax Baptisa era, with many government officials gladly and willing to take public funds. Maybe the most infamous case of this would occur in late 1948, when $19 million was stolen from the state treasurer in a brazen heist by an outgoing minister of education. American organized crime also began setting up shop in Cuba, using it as a smuggling point and as a place to hide money from the American government. Mobsters became involved in Cuban society and politics, often being friendly and working with so many Cuban politicians that Cuba was sometimes accused of being a country under gangsterismo. Political violence would become slowly more and more common, vote buying was a common practice, and while there was some improvement in taking people up out of poverty, many still remained poor, with something like 1/3 of the island in poverty. In the late 40s, upset with the direction the Auténtico party was taking, i.e. allowing corruption to run rampant, the Orthodox Party was founded, which intended to end corruption and oppose American imperialism on the island. It was headed by popular politician Eduardo Chivas, who famously killed himself on live TV in 1951, just before presidential elections scheduled to take place next year. But these elections would never come. After opinion polls showed Batista, who was running, likely wouldn't win, he with loyal army units overthrew the government and set up a provisional government. While previously he had the support of a wide range of groups when in office in the 40s, this changed when he outlawed and cracked down on all opposition, set up a secret police to torture and murder any who opposed him, and began cozying up even more with American businesses, gangsters, and government in the country. This didn't stop many from protesting and organizing. Just a little over a year after Batista's coup, on July 26, 1953, a little over 100 rebels, mostly ex-Orthodox Party members, attempted to take over the Moncada military barracks in Santiago de Cuba. While this group of rebels would be very easily crushed, the leader of the rebels, a young and charismatic lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro, would end up surviving and be put on trial. Castro would use the trial to lambast the Batista government and would famously claim, quote, "History will absolve me," unquote, of his attack on the government. Castro would end up going to jail with his brother Raul Castro and other revolutionaries, but 2 years later, Batista would offer general amnesty to many opposition fighters, with the Castro brothers fleeing to Mexico. While in Mexico, Fidel would form the July 26 movement, or M26, which combined Cuban nationalism and leftist thought. The Castro brothers would be joined by several other Cuban revolutionaries, and famously Argentine Che Guevara, a man who I can never pronounce correctly, and in late 1956 would launch a seaborne landing in eastern Cuba. These M26 rebels would suffer mass casualties in the first weeks of their landing. Out of the 82 men who landed on Cuba, less than 20 would survive the first week after an ambush by government troops resulted in a rout of many of the inexperienced revolutionaries. However, the Castro brothers, Che, and a handful of others would make it to the eastern Sierra Maestra mountain range, and began a guerrilla war against the government that would be known as the Cuban Revolution. But these bands of fighters in the Sierra Maestra wouldn't be the only opposition to Batista. M26 had other bands of fighters, largely at first cells of urban fighters, sympathetic towards Castro's mission. These were led by Frank Paez, who would, while Castro landed on Cuba, stage several armed attacks against the Cuban government across the island. Paez would be a powerful player in M26 until 1957, when he was killed by the police. Other revolutionary groups also existed. They are varied in both size and tactics, with some wanting to use strikes and protests to end Batista, while others favored M26's more militant approach. The most powerful of these guerrilla groups would be the Revolutionary Directorate, a student-led movement that primarily waged an urban war against Batista and in the early days of the revolution was debatably more powerful and influential. However, it slowly started to lose grip as continued police crackdowns and some risky attacks resulted in much of the Directorate's leadership being wiped out. It never disappeared, but by mid-1957, M26 had become the most powerful opposition to Batista. M26's growth was supported by a variety of factors. Firstly, it was backed by former members of the Orthodox and Auténtico parties, who supported his goal of overthrowing Batista. Obvious, I know. Fidel would sign in 1957 with other opposition figures a promise to set up a provisional government with other opposition figures that would push for new elections and progressive social reform. That being said, there was tension between Fidel and other more moderate opposition figures who thought Fidel was too extreme. Fidel's revolutionary character made him well liked by many of Cuba's poor and disadvantaged. Women in particular would play an important role in the revolution, many serving as either spies passing information to the guerrillas or even serving in combat roles. Others were inspired by the romantic, larger-than-life image Fidel had painted for himself as a man of the people. Even the American press loved Castro, with several news interviews bringing him to an international audience. Several Americans became so inspired that they decided to go to Cuba to fight with the revolutionaries. By late 1957, it was clear Batista was on the back foot, with rebels increasingly taking large parts of the rural countryside, forming their own de facto state. Next year, Batista would see large segments of the church, civil society, his once communist allies, and even the United States, which had largely supplied Batista's army, reject him, with the U.S. cutting off arms shipments to the Batista government. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country on a plane to New York. Revolutionaries quickly took charge of the country. The first order of business for many revolutionaries was getting back at Batista's lackeys. The revolutionaries attempted to set up revolutionary tribunals where they would convict and often sentence to death those associated with the Batista government, in particular, hunting down members of the secret police. But many of Batista's allies wouldn't actually be killed in these tribunals, more often killed via mob violence, as ragtag revolutionaries and friends and relatives of the victims of Batista's regime took to massacring those they believed responsible. The death toll of the initial period of revenge is unclear, ranging from the hundreds to the thousands. It would lead to a couple of different things. Firstly, it helped pave the way to the revolutionaries' hold on power, as much of their opposition was killed. It also helped bring about some of the first rifts in the revolution, as more moderate members became more uneasy with the blood being spilt, while others believed they were well justified in bringing justice to war criminals. And it led the American press to begin to sour on Fidel. Finally, it helped escalate a growing number of Cubans fleeing the country, which I'll touch up on a bit more later. After about a month of consolidating their hold on power, the Cuban revolutionaries set up a government that was a mix of various factions, ranging from liberals to revolutionary socialists. They quickly got to work bringing about reform and revolution to Cuba. They raised wages, reduced rents, cut electricity rates, seized government property, put progressive taxes in place, invested more into health, education, and housing, encouraged integration between white and black Cubans, cracked down on prostitution, fired many government employees, reduced corruption, and ended the link between the American mafia and Cuban political institutions. These policies were often pushed for by the Cuban public, who often began forming their own social groups, and in particular, many rural workers began joining unions and occupying their workplaces, demanding the nationalization of sugar and other major industries. Funnily enough, in 1960, a funeral would be held for U.S. companies who had their land and property taken and nationalized by the Cuban government. Rural regions of the country experienced some of the greatest change as infrastructure and public works were built throughout the country. Land reform was carried out with large landowners having their property seized and divided up. The new Cuban government, as time went on, became increasingly more radical and undoubtedly was reshaping Cuba. But this reshaping would open up many questions of the revolution. The Cuban Revolution, Fidel's rule, and the nature of the revolution is, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a very heavily debated topic. There's hundreds of controversies I could start diving into, but I want to hone in really on two. Firstly, there is the question, was Fidel a communist? Fidel at this point never openly declared himself a communist. I like Ferrer's description of his ideology, describing him as a mix of Marti and Marx, a left-wing nationalist. However, a lot of ink has been spilt on what Fidel's ideology was when he took over. This was important as some revolutionaries wanted Fidel to embrace communism and turn Cuba into a tropical USSR, while other revolutionaries feared communism, and slowly some Cuban exiles and American politicians began accusing him of cozying up to the Soviets. This communist rift was very important as it opens up a second controversy I want to highlight, which was the Cuban Revolution supposed to be a social revolution or a political one? People like Fidel viewed it as a social revolution that was supposed to rise the people of Cuba up out of poverty and fundamentally transform Cuban society from one that Batista and his predecessors had created. However, many of the more moderate figures opposed Batista and fought for the revolution to restore Cuban democracy. While they may have wanted some social reforms, they viewed it as more important for the new government to organize elections. Fidel promised reform now and elections later, which led many segments of the opposition to begin to fear that he would become another Batista, an anti-democratic strongman. Between 1959 and 1960, slowly more and more of the moderate figures in the government began stepping away. These figures would form the nucleus of Cuban anti-revolutionaries. Some of these anti-revolutionaries would begin to voice dissent against the new government, but quickly they found it difficult, as newspaper articles critical towards the government had coletitas at the end of them, with supporters of the government responding to and criticizing the article, while at the same time, most of the independent unions and press slowly began to disappear, absorbed and replaced by government-approved alternatives. Some Cubans did try to violently resist the government, with several ex-revolutionaries, and the remnants of Batista's loyalists going back into the mountains, but these movements would be fairly small and unable to really challenge the government. Many upset with the government simply left the country, with many going to Miami. These Cuban exiles began organizing flights over the island, bombing sugar mills, and distributing anti-government propaganda. Almost immediately, these groups came into contact with the American government, with the State Department and CIA both aiding the exiles. By the end of 1960, America had turned from cautious to outright hostile towards the Cuban state. Opposing the nationalization the state was carrying out that hurt American businessmen, argued Cuba wasn't democratic, and feared Cuba would become a puppet of the USSR. Ironically, as America became more hostile, the USSR and Cuba grew closer together. By 1961, diplomatic relations between America and Cuba had completely broken down, and America began actively plotting the overthrow of the new Cuban government. A CIA-organized battalion of 1,500 Cubans, known as Brigade 2506, was planned to land in Cuba and, like Castro, form the nucleus of a resistance movement that would overthrow the Castro government. And similar to Castro in 1956, the landing at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 would result in disastrous casualties among the would-be rebels. After 3 days, even with American airstrikes and tanks to fend off the Cuban army, Brigade 2506 was defeated and its surviving members captured. While a lot of ink has been spilt on why they lost, maybe one of the most important reasons was just simply the fact that when Castro landed, he was aided by supporters across the island who distracted Batista's forces. While there was an undercurrent of dissent for Castro, the fact of the matter is Castro was popular, at the very least, with a significant chunk of the Cuban population, larger than those who opposed him. But Castro still feared Cuba getting attacked by the Americans, as bombing runs over Cuba continued and the CIA continued to fund Cuban exile groups. As Cuba and the USSR grew closer, the USSR proposed to Castro Soviet nuclear missiles to be sent to Cuba. This was to combat American nuclear missiles that were deployed in Turkey and Italy, and for Castro it was a way to prevent an American invasion of Cuba, or at the very least, give Cubans a way to seriously harm the United States if they did. The Americans in mid-October discovered the missiles in Cuba, which resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where America blockaded Cuba, and the world debatably came the closest it ever has to nuclear war. To save some time, after 13 days, it was decided for the Soviets to withdraw missiles from Cuba, and the US would do the same in Turkey and pledge not to invade Cuba. This for Castro was frustrating, as the Cubans weren't involved in negotiations to end the crisis. The crisis resulted in Cuba, while not distancing itself from the USSR, did help Cuba develop a more independent foreign policy and helped increase infrastructure and military buildup on the island, as many Soviet bases were used for military bases and military equipment, and new military hardware was brought in. The missile crisis also resulted in a shift in American foreign policy towards Cuba. American policy began to move away from the outright violent overthrow of Castro and move towards an approach that focused more on economic pressure and supporting exile groups. Earlier in 1962, Operation Northwoods, a planned false flag campaign to get America and Cuba into a war, was proposed and shut down. CIA bombings in Cuba slowly reduced, ending in the late 60s, and CIA support for violent Cuba rebel groups dried up, officially. That being said, even up to today, many Cuban exile groups ranging from pressure groups to violent paramilitaries like Alpha 66 are accused of being aided by the American government, or at least parts of it. Instead, probably the biggest pressure America would put on Cuba would be the Cuban embargo. In the early 60s, America began sanctioning Cuba and imposing trade restrictions in an attempt to hurt the Cuban economy. This policy would prove to be extremely long-lasting, being sustained throughout the rest of the Cold War, although there would be a brief thaw in Cuba-American relations in the late 70s. After the Bay of Pigs, Cuba enters a period known as the push for communism. This was a period where the Cuban government, depending on your view, either converted to Marxist-Leninism or dropped any pretense of not being communist. In 1961, the M26 movement merged with the Communist, at that point called the Popular Socialist Party, and the remnants of the pro-revolutionary Directorate, into the Integrated Revolutionary Organization, which became the Communist Party of Cuba, which still runs the country to this day. All other political parties are officially banned. The period after the Cuban Missile Crisis saw a continued push to nationalize any remaining parts of the private sector. Major changes came to everyday people as agrarian reform saw the rest of private land nationalized, free nurseries set up, education was nationalized, and socialist values were instituted in schoolchildren, and literacy dramatically expanded. USSR and Cuban relations increased as Cuba increasingly fell into the communist bloc. At the height of the push for communism came the 10 million ton harvest campaign, with the government making it a goal to get 10 million tons of sugar from that year's harvest, which would increase the state's coffers, and therefore could begin seriously industrializing Cuba and move away from an economy reliant almost entirely on sugar. The harvest was in many ways similar to the Great Leap Forward in China, with hundreds of thousands of Cubans, ranging from students to white-collar professionals to artists, going into the fields to cut sugarcane. Unfortunately, many of those cutting the sugarcane had no idea how and were extremely clumsy and slow at it. Even worse, it became clear fairly quickly that with so many people putting their lives and work on hold to cut sugarcane, other economic ventures were put to a standstill. When the harvest began in August of 1969, enthusiasm was high, but by May of 1970, the government had to call it quit. Only 8.5 million tons of sugar were produced, and even worse, sugar prices that year were low, which prevented efforts to industrialize. The failure of the 10 million tons harvest campaign hurt the Cuban economy, but more importantly, it would see a significant shift in Cuba as the idealistic days of the 60s were left behind and the gray years of the 70s had arrived. Trade with the USSR did help the economy bounce back, and some limited industrialization did occur, but the 70s began with Cuba unable to shift away from sugar and disillusionment setting in for some. I talked a lot about some of the major geopolitical and economic developments the Cuban Revolution had produced, so let's shift towards examining some important social changes. Looking at it broadly, and I want to emphasize broadly, the Cuban Revolution was a progressive revolution that saw the social hierarchy of pre-revolutionary Cuba turned upside down. Freire talks about the new class dynamics that emerged post-revolution as people from lower class backgrounds saw increased social mobility. Disadvantaged groups saw some of the biggest changes. While no laws were passed, at the very least that I know of, that were specifically designed to benefit just Afro-Cubans, many of the revolution's policies that were used to lift people up out of poverty disproportionately benefited Afro-Cubans, who tended to make up a majority of the island's poor. Public spaces and organizations were created to help discourage racial segregation, and Cuba made it a policy to aid black radicals in the US, offering them a safe harbor. That being said, Castro viewed the solution to racism as requiring just colorblind laws that didn't explicitly prevent discrimination, and speaking up loudly about racism in post-revolutionary Cuba could result in the government cracking down on you. Women also benefited from the revolution. Women were encouraged more and more to join the workforce and even the armed forces. Overall, political opportunities for women increased post-revolution as their efforts in fighting for and bringing about the revolution saw them rewarded. The Cuban government in the 70s tried to make both men and women completely equal, with the Family Code in 1975 declaring that men and women were, quote, absolutely equal, unquote, and in marriage, everything was supposed to be completely equal. This, however, was slightly complicated by the fact that in private settings, there still were certain expectations of women. So like Ferrer brings up hanging laundry, something that if men did, they would see as humiliating. The revolution had established greater rights for black people and women with some caveats. But the same could not be said for gay Cubans, who saw increasing pressure to conform to societal standards as the LGBTQ community was viewed as bourgeoisie. From 1965 to 1967, work camps were set up that were designed to transform gay Cubans into proper new men who would embrace revolutionary ideals. Slowly, over several decades, attitudes would start to change until the 90s when the LGBTQ community became more accepted and gay marriage was legalized in 2022 following a referendum. While the gray years saw the revolutionary spirit retreat domestically, this was not a retreat internationally, as Cuba became a major supporter of leftist and revolutionary movements throughout the world and worked closely with the Soviet Union in supporting communism in the global south. Cuban military advisors would support several different states and organizations, such as Algeria in the 60s, the Simba rebellions of the Congo in the mid-60s, South Yemen and Syria in the 70s, Ethiopia in the late 70s, and various Latin American revolutionaries from the late 50s to the 90s. Some notable interventions including backing Che Guevara's expedition into Bolivia in the late 60s, Grenada's revolutionary government in the 80s, and going back to the Colombia episode, training the ELN. The most impactful of Cuba's military expeditions would be in Portuguese Africa, backing African rebels in the 60s and 70s until those colonies became independent. They would stay on and play a critical role in supporting the leftist MPLA government against the right-wing apartheid-backed UNITA rebels in Angola, playing a crucial role in building up the Angolan government and preventing its collapse. Cuba would also send thousands of doctors across the Third World, helping increase Cuba's soft power. Cuba overall attempted a very interventionist policy, both for ideological reasons, to aid revolution across the world, and also for more practical reasons, to help aid and set up governments friendly to the Cuban government, to aid anti-American and anti-capitalist governments, and to prove to their beneficiary, the USSR, that they were an important and useful ally in the Cold War. This led in the 80s Cuba to be labeled by the American government a, quote, state sponsor of terrorism, unquote. I don't want to get bogged down in the history of the Cuban American community, but I probably should take a second and discuss it and the ways of immigration coming from Cuba in the 20th century. The Cuban American community had existed since the 1880s, with famous Cuban leaders like Martí finding a home in New York City in the late 1800s. However, post-revolution, the Cuban American community exploded in size. The first Cuban exiles, known as the Golden Exiles, came into America right after the Cuban Revolution, were mainly rich, educated, white, and tied to Batista. However, quickly this started to change as more and more Cuban exiles were people who had supported Castro, but for whatever reason became disillusioned with the revolution. Starting in the 60s and to the 70s, a new wave of Cuban exiles, initiated by the Freedom Flights, organized flights between the Cuban and American government, would be older and more likely to be middle class, Jewish, and/or Chinese, as these people were escaping new radical revolutionary policies. Another wave of Cuban exiles would emerge in the 80s. These exiles, unlike the exiles of previous years, weren't as motivated by politics and more motivated by economics, being poorer and blacker than previous immigrants. Also, they were technically more likely to be criminals, although their crimes could range from robbery to simply protesting the government. The exodus of hundreds of thousands of Cubans out of Cuba was beneficial to both the Cuban government, as many political dissidents left the country, and the government, which by the 80s was struggling to maintain economic conditions, didn't have to spend as much benefiting the population, and the United States government, as they could use the Cuban exiles as agents to promote anti-communist rhetoric in the Cold War, and to serve as a moral victory against the Cuban communist government. The wave of Cubans fleeing to the United States would increase in the 90s, as the Soviet Union fell. The USSR and the Eastern Bloc as a whole had served as an important trading partner with the Cuban government, which was surrounded by largely hostile states that refused to trade with it. When the Soviets fell, Cuba lost its important trading partner, and further American sanctions under George H.W. Bush in late 1992 that prevented foreign companies that operated in Cuba from also operating in the U.S. saw increased economic destabilization. This was the start of the special period. Rations, which had been present since the 60s, were severely reduced. Sugar production slowed. Many lost their jobs via austerity as the government reduced its budget. Luxury items and even gas disappeared. Prices shot up. Blackouts sprung up throughout the country, and the state lost 70% of its buying power. Major protests sprung up, and for a bit, it seemed like communist Cuba might go the way of the USSR and many other Warsaw Pact countries. But remarkably, it survived. Why it survived is complicated, but it seems there were several factors that helped it stay afloat. First off, the Cuban opposition wasn't as organized as other opposition forces in Europe, and much of the opposition that did exist was found in the United States, so protest movements didn't have immediate leaders that could lead them. Secondly, it seems that conditions in Cuba were never at the same levels as many other Warsaw Pact countries, so a reduction in living standards didn't hurt them as much as it hurt Eastern Europe. Cuba also benefited from being highly militarized and ideologically ready to oppose the West due to America's historical involvement in propping up Batista and other unpopular Cuban rulers, and its role in the failed Bay of Pigs and missile crisis. Finally, the Cuban government was able to make reforms to the system that, while didn't fix everything, they did make life manageable and kept the government afloat. As I talked about earlier, austerity helped reduce government expenditures and saw the government become more open towards some private businesses existing on the island and foreign investment. Limited economic liberalization allowed some small businesses to start being set up, and foreign companies, particularly Spanish, Mexican, and Canadian, invest into the country, which helped bring in new revenues for the government and helped reduce unemployment. The Venezuelan government, starting in the 2000s, also began supporting Cuba, seeing as both were left-wing states in an antagonistic relationship towards the United States. The economy began really diversifying away from sugar, with mining becoming increasingly important, and tourism exploded. Tourism was relatively small in the Cold War, but increased government investment and the dollarization of the Cuban economy made Cuba more attractive to tourists. By 2000, millions were entering the country every year, often being Canadian, although a decent number of European and even Americans also visited, typically going to experience the tropical nature of the island, but also exploring the country's unique history and culture, leftists going to support the Cuban Revolution, Cuban exiles visiting relatives, or even some going to Cuba to get access to free healthcare that isn't available in their country. It also created an economic dynamic where those who worked in the tourism industry were more likely to have access to American dollars, which were worth more than the standard Cuban pesos, and thus became maybe not richer, but did see more benefits compared to those who didn't come into contact with tourists. This resulted in some sense of unfairness regarding the tourism industry, especially as the government was viewed as spending more accommodating tourists than helping their own people. Others, in reaction, were encouraged to get a second job, typically hustling, and controversially, prostitution returned to the island. Fidel had by the 2000s been in power for over 4 decades and was very clearly growing old. He, in 2006, began slowly stepping away from power, and in 2008, his brother Raul was put in charge, although Fidel would remain an influential voice in the country's politics for another decade. While opponents of the Cuban Revolution hoped the end of Fidel would mean the death of the revolution, Cuba continued on, with Raul continuing to slowly introduce more free market reforms into the economy, and the Cuban military coming to play an increasingly important role in the economy. In late 2016, Fidel would die, being a man both beloved and hated, and undoubtedly one of, if not the most important figure in Cuban history. America and Cuba had since the revolution been at best cold towards each other to outright plotting the collapse of the other. But in late 2014, it seemed there might be a change. American President Barack Obama and Raul Castro began talking about bridging the gap between the two countries, and in 2015, limited trade was opened up between America and Cuba. Obama visited the island, and there was a sense on the island that things might be changing between America and Cuba. However, after the first election of Donald Trump in 2016, this thaw would quickly be cut short as the Trump administration went back to trying to limit trade with Cuba as much as possible, even putting more restrictions on the island. In a kind of bizarre decision, in the waning days of Joe Biden's rule, I'm talking mid-January 2025, Biden removed Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list, but just 5 days later, after Trump returned to office following the 2024 election, this was reversed and Cuba put back on the list. It is believed Trump is going to put even further restrictions on Cuba, so it seems unlikely relations are going to improve anytime soon. In 2018, Raul Castro would step down and be replaced by Miguel Diaz-Canel, the vice president, and had formerly served as a minister of education, along with some provincial roles. Canel is unique in being born just after the revolution in 1960. Canel's rule started off with signs of some reform. A new constitution was adopted which allowed further privatization of the economy, put term limits on the president, and promoted progressive social policy, such as banning discrimination based on race, gender, and sexuality, and reformed the Constitution to remove references to marriage being solely between one man and one woman. But overall, Cuba's political structure and overall policy remains the same. It is still under a self-defined socialist economy, although with an increasing proportion of the economy controlled by private businesses, strong government spending on social rights like education and healthcare, under a one-party state with all other parties banned, and generally hostile towards the US, while supportive of America's enemies ranging from Venezuela, to Iran, to China, to Russia. Cuba had for decades had a sizable opposition movement, but they were after the 60s almost entirely based outside the country in the United States. With the special period and austerity making life more difficult for people, an opposition movement slowly has been gaining ground. In 2003, 75 opposition figures and journalists were arrested in what became known as the Black Spring, although this failed to prevent further discontent. In 2021, thousands would take to the streets to protest a lack of food and medicine due to COVID's economic impacts and demanding change. The protests would see a crackdown with hundreds arrested. Other smaller protests would break out in 2023 and 2024, which shows increasingly there is more and more people upset with the Cuban government. How big the opposition movement is and what their goals are do vary depending on who you ask. If you ask those sympathetic to the opposition, they will say that every single man, woman, and child in Cuba wanted to overthrow the government and end the Communist Party's rule, with any claiming otherwise paid for by the Cuban government. While those sympathetic to the government tend to say the protesters are either just people protesting solely convictions, but actually love the Communist Party of Cuba, are a small minority taking up less than 0.1% of the population, and or are all CIA-paid protesters. I did present the most bombastic claims from both sides, so undoubtedly the truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but it does seem more likely that in the coming years, we are going to hear more about protest or opposition figures coming out of Cuba. As the economic embargo continues to hurt the economy, the government bans any opposition to them, and war hawks in the United States continue to view Cuba as one of America's main rivals in the Americas. If the Cuban communists will hold on to power for another couple decades, if the opposition will be able to take control of the island at some point, and or if America will continue to remain the main enemy of Cuba is something we will just have to wait and see. So why does Cuba exist? Cuba as a political unit was created from Spanish colonialism, where it was made an important trading post in Spain's colonial empire. It for much of the late 19th century fought for independence, but during this time and even after independence, it was in danger of being absorbed into the United States, which took an increasingly aggressive imperialist role. After roughly half a century under the thumb of America, Cuban revolutionaries under Fidel Castro radically transformed the country into one of the main Marxist geopolitical rivals of America. It seems Cuba and American relations are always going to play an important role in influencing Cuban history. Hopefully in the future these relations will lean towards the more positive side, unlike the more negative side it has historically leaned into. So up next we will go to Cyprus, prepare for the Ottomans, the British, ethnic division that, spoiler alerts, splits up the island, literally, and asking, is Cyprus Asian or European? So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. This episode took a lot longer than I was expecting, and it's longer than I was expecting. Right now, it looks like it might be like around an hour. It's just way longer than I was expecting. But hopefully it turns out good. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Up next, I'm going to do Iraqi political parties, then I will do the history of Cyprus, and then I will do the history of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used are Al Jazeera's report, U.S.-Cuban Relations, Nations Announced Surprise Deal, Blowback Season 2, Cornucopia Pan America's video, A Brief Political History of Cuba, Ada Ferreira's book, An American History of Cuba, Geography Now's video on Cuba, History with Hilbert's video on the Cuban Revolution, TLDR news reports, Do Cuban Protests Spell the End for its Communist Government? And finally, Wikipedia.